to have with me today three fantastic panelists bringing very different perspectives to this debate to share with you, and hopefully to stimulate some thoughts and contributions and questions from all of you who are listening and watching today. First of all, I'm going to introduce Vaishali Sinha, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer of Renew Power. And many of you will know Renew Power, arguably the most successful of India's independent power producers in the renewable energy space, currently with 7 gigawatts of operational power and a pipeline that will take that to 10 gigawatts shortly. And Vaishali is also chair of the Renew Foundation. Secondly, to introduce Kelly Goddard. Kelly Goddard is now the Senior Vice President for Operations and Head of ESG at Brookfield Renewable Power. But Kelly's only been there a couple of months because Kelly was previously 16 years at BP, so also understands this sector intimately. And last but not least, my good friend and former colleague Santosh Jairam, who has sadly left KPMG, but has found himself gainful employment as the Global Head of Sustainability at that well-known global technology business, HCL Technologies Limited. So fantastic to have the three of you with us. And the way we're going to run this panel is I'm going to ask each of Vaishali and Kelly and Santosh in turn to sort of theme set the things that they would like to share with you over the course of 5 minutes or so each. And then we'll turn this into a conversation and a set of questions. So Vaishali, the floor is yours. Over to you.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here on this platform, which is, having some very pertinent discussions, which I think all of us need to reflect on. And just listening to experts from, all around the world really gets us to think about how we can do better in our own zones and in our own sectors. So as you mentioned, I'm Vaishali Sinha, and Renew Power has been an IPP, which is an independent power producer in India, one of the leading players in India. We've got about 110 sites across 10 states in India. We've been operating for the last 10 years, so been around for some time. Seems like a century, but only a decade. A lot has happened in India in that time. And just to give you some context and why I think we should be addressing some of the points which are very important. When we started this business, I don't think there was a sector which existed in 2010. People didn't really think that turbines, other than providing for tax incentives, could be clustered together to form sites for power generation, which would be affordable. That happened. So that was an opportunity, I guess, we spotted a little bit ahead of our time. And it's great to be operating in a country where our leadership is very committed to this sector. And it may sound a bit cliched, but if I could share that, I think a commitment to the sector, either it comes from the heart, it is, you have to be passionate about it, you have to believe in the benefit of what you're doing, and it makes sense then. But I think our journey has been a little bit about, building a business model in an area which is good, doing it in a good way, and also contributing to a very critical area. So when we started, we were quite alone. We didn't have much company, but over the years we've got some company, and quite a lot of company, and huge company now. So things are changing, as they say, who moved the cheese? Somebody really did, and I'm glad they did, because I think we really need that. And so the important thing is that from an area which was not a viable business model, people recognize that, of course, at a higher level, at a global level, at a country level, that climate change is critical, and we all need to act, and mitigating it must be done. And there's been a lot of innovation around it. And that's where the opportunity is for people like us to come together to discuss and exchange ideas. I'd love to do that. And the good news also is, I'm going to be the good news person on this panel. So the good news also is that, as we do business, we kind of, do a lot of other interesting things. We contribute to about 1.5% of India's power capacity and also avoid 1.1% of the country's emissions. So, to be, carbon neutral, is not a thing for us, because what we do is like 200 times of what we must do to stay neutral. So I think we are in a good space with respect to some of the checkbox kind of items. But what I really want to bring up on this panel is that how are things changing as the world has moved ahead in this journey, as the clock is ticking towards the goals we've set for ourselves, and how must we ensure that mitigation contributors are well incentivized to do better, because they must do better to accelerate the transition, and we must encourage other sectors, which we call hard to abate sectors for sure, but we want to make sure we encourage them to transition and not to stay where they are in a different robe. I'd rest my case here till we come back, Richard, but I'm glad to be here with all of you. I can't wait to hear comments from my co-panelists. What an excellent set of panelists we have here. Look forward to this discussion. Thank you. Back to you, Richard.
Shani, thank you very much for those opening thoughts. Before I bring Kelly in, you said, who moved the cheese? And I'm just in, who do you think actually moved the cheese? What's your take on why we have this sort of quite seismic, changing circumstances in which businesses are due to operate?
That's a good question, and I hope we had a very simple, non-complex answer to that. There has been a lot of naysayers and a lot of people who are just addicted to perhaps the good old cheddar. Sorry, I'm just, probably there are other kind of flavors which have been out there, and they've proven to be tastier, right? And they've proven to be healthier, and so and maybe perhaps not as expensive. And people have tried them and, sorry, I'm just making this a little bit funny, tasted them and tested them. And so, metaphorically speaking, and if we move away from cheese, the sort of the dirty business versus the clean business, and the ability to create value in the clean business, and to see what it can do to help us achieve our goals, whether it's 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, and 70. Believe it or not, I'm not sure if I'm going to be alive till then. I'm going to be 100 years by then. But people have proven that now, as we speak, there are innovations, there is a challenge, and we can use these innovations to address those challenges. You can make money as you do that. Perhaps that's what's moving the cheese. I hope I answered your question.
This will forevermore be known as the cheese tasting panel. So we'll thank you for setting us off on that. But I guess what you're saying is that we've seen that a better future is possible. We've seen that technologies mean that we can, deliver energy that, switches the lights on and the heating on for people all over the world without polluting the atmosphere and without polluting our streets. We've seen that we can get vehicles that are as effective as vehicles powered by petrol and diesel, but they're now powered by electric batteries. So we can see that there is a better future there, and therefore that's driving a sort of popular clamour, if you like, to get there as quick as possible, and obviously then drawing lots of businesses in their wake. So thank you for that. Kelly, over to you to give us your opening thoughts.
Thank you, Richard. Interesting conversation indeed already. But it is great to be here today and on a panel with yourself and Vaishali and Santush, and see the commitment we all have to driving sustainability within our companies, but also to have a wider impact. Like Vaishali, I'm also an optimist, so I don't know how interesting this debate will be, but it's good to see that we're all committed to moving the dial here, and we all believe that we can get to where we need to be to reach net zero and drive a broader sustainability impact. As you mentioned, Richard, I am the head of ESG for Brookfield Renewable, and just a bit about Brookfield Renewable. We are one of the largest owners, operators, and investors in renewable energy. We actually develop and operate assets ourselves, and we have decades of experience in doing so. This has resulted in over 20 gigawatts of installed renewable capacity. The pace is growing. This has more than tripled in the last 5 years. And we have about 2.3 gigawatts installed in India and a development pipeline there as well. Our overall development pipeline is about 31 gigawatts of development pipeline, and we are one of the largest non-state-owned developers. So great to be here and great to be part of Brookfield Renewable. We have a global presence. We're in every market. We have local teams in every market where we operate. We have about 60 billion of assets under management, and we are diversified across hydro, wind, solar, distributed generation, and storage. So in addition to our operations and our development pipelines, we also recently announced a new fund called the Brookfield Global Transition Fund, which is dedicated to accelerating the transition to net zero, but also earning attractive returns. And in order to do this, we do have some fundamental criteria. And one is that all of our investments will be aligned to Paris and have Paris-aligned decarbonization plans. And the other one is we know it has to be broader than just climate. So we are establishing transparent and measurable targets to demonstrate our impact with considerations across the SDGs. So we do think that between our operations and our fund, we are well positioned to play a meaningful role, as are many others in the energy transition. And I know there was a poll question. I know it's not up here, but I read it and it said, what are the most significant factors driving the adoption of ESG for businesses? And I think I was surprised to see that there was one answer not on there. And I would say, first and foremost, for us, it's about the right thing to do. And it's what's needed to reach the Paris Agreement as well as wider sustainability goals. I take it wasn't on there, Richard, because it's a given. And maybe that's how the cheese is moved, is that everyone knows it's a given that it's the right thing to do. And that's a good thing. But I think across the other answers, we would say yes to them all. We do see it as a massive competitive advantage, especially for companies that are able to offer solutions. And we know that regulation is increasing. So I think last year there was about 31 open consultations across regulations and standards. We expect many of those to come into force, and we expect many, many more to open up. So there's a real opportunity to get ahead of regulation and help shape some of the thinking and the standards. And then importantly, we know that being a leader in ESG retains and attracts new investors, new customers, and importantly, talent. And I think there's case studies and proof points for all of those, and they continue to grow. So I would say, it's a pleasure to be here today and discuss recent developments, including if and how COP has changed the ESG ecosystem. What role does the ESG ecosystem play in helping to build trust? And how are expectations of companies really evolving? As well as the opportunity that comes with all of that. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much indeed. And I was just going to come straight back to you on COP, because obviously, Brookfield has been super proactive in terms of the application of its financial muscle, let's call it, towards the Paris goals in particular. Is your sense that what came out of Glasgow has adjusted or accelerated or changed your strategy or ambition in any way, or is it just business as usual?
It's a good question. I think there were several knowns that COP reinforced. So first, that climate change is one of the greatest threats, and decarbonization is and has to be a global priority. I would say the second thing that COP reinforced is that achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050 or sooner will require a fundamental change to all areas of the global economy. Thirdly, I will say that everyone must play a part. I think it was clear in COP by the delegates, but also by the messages that everyone has a role to play and must play their part, and action and collaboration are required by governments, by civil society, corporations, and capital providers. And the fourth one, and I think Vaishali alluded to it, is that innovation and technology, financing solutions, and policy are all also required to see the change we need to reach 1.5. So I don't think any of those four are new news, but I think those themes came across strongly throughout the duration of COP. I don't think it's a surprise that there are competing opinions on how successful COP was, and I think it'll take some time for countries and the public and private sector to really digest and comprehend how the agreements, or in some cases the lack of agreement, will and should affect policies and activities. But definitely some positives coming out with new initiatives launched and additional pledges made. I think of particular note is, the promise from many world leaders to end deforestation by 2030. I think the agreement of more than 100 countries to reduce methane emissions. You mentioned it, the commitment by GFINs, which is over 450 financial firms with assets totaling more than 130 trillion to manage those assets in line with net zero. I think we saw the long-awaited approval of the rule book for the global carbon market and the establishment of ISSB, which we're all hopeful that will develop a globally consistent standard for disclosure. So I think some real positives. I think, it's fair to say a disappointment in the level of indices, with the estimates and the analysis published on Climate Action Tracker of those commitments only totaling up to about 2.4 degrees. And I think the UN Secretary Antonio Guterres said 1.5, while it's alive, is on life support. So, there is hope when the countries come back together in 2022 that they will significantly increase their commitments, and we will see a 1.5 trajectory. So what does all that mean? It's a long way of answering your question, I think, Richard, but what does it all mean for us and for the power sector in particular? Because I do think we are on the edge of the transition. I mean, the first thing is, I think coming out of it, no one would argue that there is an increased expectation and pressure on the private sector to deliver decarbonization as well as in nature. And with respect to the power sector and renewables, I think COP reinforced the need for large-scale renewables, and that this will continue to play a focus. And really the recognition that really the growth of solar and wind will continue to be a focus, given the cost and they are the lowest cost of bulk renewable power. So again, nothing new there, but reinforced the role of solar and wind. We know that the scale of new solar build-out required annually to meet the net zero pathway is only slightly higher than total existing solar capacity today. So a massive scale up. I think the IEA roadmap anticipates about 630 gigawatts of solar needing to be added annually. So that's a massive scale up of solar, and there's proof points about wind as well. I think the other thing we saw is increased commitments from companies around net zero. I think there's about over 5,000 companies now, and these are growing all the time, committing to net zero. And so I think with this, we see, the growth of corporate funded projects and partnerships, those companies considering how they use and source power, and looking to renewables to help them reduce their scope too. So again, a big opportunity for us in renewables. And the third area I would say is really about new technologies. We know that hydrogen will be needed at scale, but we also know that renewables will need to play a central role in the development of and enabling of these technologies. So I would say the pathway needs, the corporation needs, and the new technology needs all create a compelling commercial opportunity. And we really see the discussions, the side conversations, and the other broader commitments around COP to accelerate the momentum here.
Wow, that was the most brilliant encapsulation and summary of what came out of COP that I think I've heard, Kelly. So thank you very much. And you touched on technology at the very end of that, which is the perfect segue across to Santosh. Santosh, do share with us your opening thoughts, please.
So first of all, thank you, Richard, and the whole of the Enrich team for having me here. As Kelly and Vaishali mentioned, that they are optimists, so I don't want to be left out. I am also the optimist, but would sound a bit cautionary today. So I would say that to really understand the impact that ESG can create, I thought I'll place 3 thoughts during this opening remark. So the first one, post 2019, the whole of the ESG is not the same as what it was pre 2019. What we have is what I usually refer as the ESG 2.0. So who moved the cheese, right? So back to the cheese. Money started chasing ESG, and that's what the big shift happened, is what I would like to believe. And that's a big change. And the drivers are very clear and more forceful, that in just 2 years, the whole of the ESG has walked as an elephant into the boardroom, right? So in one of my articles, I think about a year back, I explained this phenomenon to a fable. I don't know, is it a fable around the world, or I think it's more of an Indian fable, the elephant in the dark, wherein a group of blindfolded persons are trying to conceptualize what the elephant is by touching it. So the first person says it's like a fat snake feeling the trunk, and the next feels the ears and says it's like a fan, and the third touches the legs and declares it's a pillar, and the fourth says it's a rope by feeling its tail. So ESG is many things. So as Anish started this conversation, I would say is that there is a need to remove that blindfold and see ESG in totality and not in parts. That would create the real impact. And so this is my first point, and that not compartmentalize and see it as a whole to create the real impact. And, just an hour back, I was in conversation with John Elkington, and who coined the famous triple bottom line. And of course, ESG is a derivative of that. In 2018, he wrote an Harvard article which said that he would like to recall the TBL. And the reasons were the same, because when he conceptualized TBL, it was not supposed to be compartmentalized, but the way it went about, people started compartmentalizing it. So I think that's the first point. The second point is, the so-called lack of visibility of a clear pathway should not deter the industry. And I've been hearing this from many people, clarities are not emerging and all those things. So there is no single way we will be able to reach the goals we plan. It's not going to be that singular path. Take the instance, one of the major oil companies decides that their business strategy would shift, which was earlier crude to fuel to crude to chemical. But another major from the same sector decides to sell off their chemical arm and ventures in a different path. Let's take COP26. I mean, we had a whole group of automobile companies who pledged to work towards reaching 100% zero emission cars by 2035 or even earlier. But some of the major ones stayed away. It doesn't mean that they are not working on this goal. So there are many ways to reach the goal. And, for example, there are the big strides on EV, and there is work happening on hydrogen. I think we mentioned that. And, the way it is kind of progressing is, so take the example of Toyota in Japan. They're still working on hydrogen-based IC engines by saying that, IC engine is not the enemy, and trying to limit the impact on the supply chain. So the so-called just transition, as we call it. So the goal is important, and the pathway will emerge, will be my second point to creating that real impact. And if there are still people sitting on the edge, seeking clarity on pathways, you are missing to create your pathway. The most irrelevant question that you can get now it would be, what is my business case for sustainability? I think the simple answer is you are still in the last decade. And the third and the last point I will make today is what I presented in my latest blog. If we are aiming to look at creating a sustainable impact, we need to strengthen the knowledge and the skill gaps, which pose a big risk going forward. Take the instance, the UK's Green Home Grant schemes. One of the most significant stimulus packages had to be shut down because of shortage of skilled workers for green retrofit. Although, you might say there are other reasons, but this was one of the major reasons. There is already a discussion on how the goals of UK's offshore energy plan will get impacted due to skill shortage. Thanks to COP26, at least in UK, you have started the discussion. Think about India's grant commitments. Now, Vaishali is here. They have grant plans. Do we have the right kind of skills? If we are looking at changing the way we have done our business in this world, then it's a big behavioral change. It has to start from schools. The way we are teaching in schools these days, I sit at home and listen to my kids on the online classes. The way they have been taught climate change is knowledge oriented. It's taught as a science. I think the pedagogy has to change to a change-oriented methodology if we want to create that real impact. So I think I would, look at ESG together, not compartmentalize, start the journey and chart own pathway. Third focus would be a change-oriented knowledge and skill enhancement. And I think that would be the three things to create the real impact. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I love your analogy about needing to see the entire elephant and the concept that ESG actually has to run through everything that we are doing. You talked about, and by the way, the skills point I think we might come back to, because I think that's a fantastically well made point, and big ramifications for businesses in terms of the investment they need to make in people skills. But you use the phrase "just transition" at one point, and can I just take you back to that? And you also signed up to being an optimist on this panel of 4 optimists. But how optimistic are you? How confident are you that it is possible to make the trajectory towards net zero, 1.5 degrees that the world needs to achieve, in a way that is just? I'm thinking both for developing countries where they still need to bring large parts of their populations in some cases out of quite extreme poverty, drive jobs, drive economic growth, and so on. And so is that compatibility there? And also even in rich economies, there's this growing worry that effectively the cost, if you like, the price of net zero will fall disproportionately or aggressively on the poor in society, and effectively exacerbate income inequalities in the world. How confident are you that we can somehow get both of those things in balance?
Yeah, I think with that question, you got me into a bit of downside of the optimism. But yeah, the challenge is that if you really want to do just transition, I think the planning has to be immaculate, and it's deep planning which is kind of required over there. Especially, for example, in India, if we are looking into, there are some particular states, especially the Bihar, UP, and some of those places, which are coal belts. And if, let us say that that's going to get impacted, but the renewables, for example, Vaishali can say, is not exactly in the same places. So there is geographical variations in terms of where new jobs would be created, where some jobs would be lost. So there are those kind of variations. So what are you going to do with that just transition? You need to have some new plans, new developments which need to evolve. So right from that stage, the planning. The second part is the reskilling, upskilling part of it, which I touched upon on that's a very, very important area. Now, talk about NDCs. If you read carefully into the NDCs, I think it's hardly about 5 countries who has talked about skilling in the whole of the NDCs which has come in. Nobody is talking about just transition and working on from, what is the new skills which are required if you are changing the kind of growth trajectories and all those kind of things. What is the kind of change? And strangely, in countries, what is happening is that you are creating a separate green skill council, which is, you cannot look at it in kind of a separate thing. I mean, for example, the automotive industry has to look at the new skills which are required in that sector. The same way each of those industry segments has to look at what is kind of evolving, rather than creating a separate Greens Council altogether. So I think the preparation for a just transition from that side is weak, but have we kind of lost the time for it? No, we can still kind of catch up on that, but I think things need to move fast on that side, Richard.
Richard, if I could come in on that just transition very quickly, just a couple of points. Thanks, Santosh, for making those comments, and all very, pertinent ones. But I think the point around the just transition is crucial. We have to ensure that the funds committed for Global South by Global North actually see their way to this part of the world. I think that's a big gap. And it will take the government leaders, the private sector, academia, to all come together to make it possible. This, civil society and everybody has to work together to ensure that we get the funds. Why is the renewable space in India booming? Because there is money chasing it, as Santosh pointed out in his earlier comments. I think there are enough challenges in this part of the world which require real attention. And I'm not talking about just business challenges. I'm talking about people dying because of climate change, people experiencing it firsthand. So the money which is sitting in a certain part of the world, where ideas are floating around on a piece of paper, really require to be addressing issues here, and the money really needs to be coming to people to solve the problems, to have the impact. I guess that would be one important step in that direction to ensure that the transition is a just one and a fair one and an inclusive one is super critical. I think why was COP26 successful? And I mean, I will not be able to match Kelly's crispness and comprehensiveness, but definitely I can say the intent was there. It wasn't incrementalism. It was intent we saw there. We saw John Kerry, Secretary Kerry, traveling the world to mobilize folks in a way which was effective. It was important to see that the private sector had a place and a seat on the table this time at the COP. And when you engage with the private sector, it delivers. And so, just coming back, so just back to you, but we have to make sure it's just. We need to get the money to this part of the world. We need to make sure it's fair. We need to make sure it's inclusive, which is super critical, because I do believe women really are at the receiving end. We all know it sounds very repetitive, but not much is being done about it. So how do we keep that, our eyes on the ball as far as these couple of topics are concerned? Back to you, Richard.
Thank you very much indeed. And we're getting some questions on the chat, which is great. And indeed, some of them were about just transition. So I think we've done that. We've done that justice, if I might say so, as a question. Can I stick with you for a moment, Vaishali? Because in your opening, you talked about the dangers of box ticking and the need for companies to really embed into the way they operate everything that leads up to sort of full and proper disclosure. But I also want to just juxtapose that against a point that Kelly made when she was reflecting on the on the sort of question to the audience and said, you know, where's the answer that says, well, it's the right thing to do. One of the announcements at COP26, as you will know, was the confirmation of the establishment of the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is clearly a good thing. I guess there's an expectation that that's going to lead to a world in which businesses are required by law or regulation to disclose. But I guess we're very conscious that the ISSB has been set up under the IFRS Foundation, and the standards which it is promulgating, which are drawn currently from SASB and IRC, all go to issues of corporate value. And they're not picking up the standards that, for example, the GRI has long advocated, which are ones which might not have any impact on the value of your business, but do have an effect on, you know, the wider community, the planet, and so on. And so just give me your reflections on that. I mean, do you think it's important that a business like with you or any business is reporting not just on their impacts that go to company value, but are also reporting on their impacts that go to wider sort of stakeholder implication?
No, absolutely. I mean, there's absolutely in my mind no question that I think gone are the days where we look inwardly on you know, what is the impact we are having with respect to our own story and our own sort of sphere of operations, etc. I think if we have to, just going back to the wider point, that if we have to meet the 1.5 degree target, we just all have to do a lot more. And we really have to push the envelope beyond ourselves. Otherwise, we are just not going to get there. So the question is that we really, I mean, I just want to summarize by saying it's absolutely crucial that we all look at how we can influence, of course, our business. It's very difficult, honestly. The easiest part is to do the checkbox exercise, Richard. I really do think that, you know, we can do 20 of them and put it on a pretty slide on a PPT, and that can have zero value. I can be just doing the most, causing the maximum amount of destruction as far as, you know, my ESG impact is concerned, but I can perhaps not do too badly on some of these ratings and frameworks. It's very difficult, and all of them are very difficult. We must do some of this because it's important. There is a standardization which helps, investors like Kelly and various other investors to evaluate the, thousands and millions of companies across the world and put them in a certain benchmark and create their own benchmarks. And we do that ourselves within our company. And all of that is important. But I think we really need to ask ourselves, why are we doing this? And what is it that we are looking to do? And I think the why of this is really important, and what is the impact we can have if we do what we are doing within the company, and what is it that we can do outside the company. And believe me, it's easier to have impact sometimes outside your company than it is to have within the company. Within the company, it's just very, very I would say challenging to bring about the culture change, the capacity building, which Santosh talked about, and and it takes a lot of effort. But sometimes it's easier to engage with with vendors and contractors, etc., and have standard and high standards of sort of requirements for them to to meet some of the scope. 3 sort of requirements and so on and so forth. So I would say that if each of us if it's not a basic norm for us and a basic new normal for us to go well beyond what we are doing and look at the larger ecosystem, we're just not going to get there. And so it's time to really, it's really time to look beyond ourselves and to look at the larger ecosystem and do a lot more than we can together.
Thank you very much. Santosh, I'm just going to put you on notice that in a minute, I'd like to start picking up questions around the S of ESG, because Anish, when he started this, said, a lot of the conversation and Rich has obviously been around the environmental, but I do want to make sure that we touch the social side as well. So I'll come to you on that in a moment. But first of all, Kelly, there's a question in the chat which asks, what specific advice for legacy energy organisations on ESG? And I guess, you know, Brookfield is a business which in a sense is turning the financial thumbscrews on legacy energy businesses amongst others. What's the advice for companies that are, you know, in that sector but risk holding, you know, seriously stranded assets? What should they be doing?
Sure, thanks, Richard. I thought that one might come to me. So I would say a few things. I would say, you know, for legacy energy, and I assume by this it means oil and gas companies, you know, it's important to manage the carbon with a focus first on decarbonization of a company's own value chain. And I think what we're seeing now is that needs to happen across all scopes. So scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. So understanding of a company's full emissions footprint and a plan to reach the Paris alignment and ideally to 1.5. We're seeing that being reflected in many of the benchmarks for oil and gas, including the TPI, SBTI, and others. So a clear expectation to first take inventory of the emissions and then have a plan to reduce those, with a focus first and foremost on decarbonization of the assets. I think it's becoming more and more restrictive for the oil and gas companies about allowable actions, and we're seeing that again reflected in the benchmarks about, you know, the need to decarbonize rather than divest. You know, and I think that's really important when we think about stranded assets, and what else can happen with those assets. I mean, the oil and gas companies have a huge capability to support the transition. They build huge projects, have knowledge of reservoirs, which is critical for carbon capture and storage, for example, knowledge of processes, critical for hydrogen, and then capital to develop in that. So it's thinking also about how do you use the capabilities and infrastructure already developed to help support the transition. But again, not just about carbon. I think both Vaishali and Santosh talked about the just transition, so a big role to play there. I think we are seeing the just transition being reflected in the ecosystem. So CA 100 Plus now has a just transition indicator in their assessment of companies, including oil and gas companies. And we're seeing CDP indicate that they will include social and governance indicators in their platforms as well. So I would say it's carbon is the most material aspect, but it's important not to just look at carbon. And as Santosh said so eloquently, we need to look at the whole ESG ecosystem and really decide where the material aspects are. Again, carbon's the obvious one, but then make sure that the others also get due attention. So that's what I would say.
Thank you very much. So as promised, Santosh, I mean, you've already raised the issue of the need to develop sort of skills for the new economy. But if we broaden out across everything that sits within the comprehension of the sort of the S in ESG, whether that's inclusion and diversity, whether it's around human rights, or whether it's around the way in which a company treats its employees, for example. I mean, it's notable, I guess, that the ISSB's initial prototype disclosures on climate, but I think everyone understands that the social disclosure expectations are going to come as well. What's your advice to companies, I guess, about, again, coming to your thing about seeing the whole elephant, how they should think about ESG in its totality, which includes that S component?
Right, thanks. I think I'll start by say there is a reason why it is on the center of ESG. So it sits at the center of ESG, right? And again, when I look into the social part of it, I feel a little, post the pandemic, it has kind of raised itself, but still there is a bit of a challenge around the whole of the S concept. You mentioned somewhere about GRI. So rather than taking the ESG route, let me kind of go into that kind of a route. And economic value addition, easy to measure, not the financial numbers, but overall an entity, how it provides economic value to the community in terms of its own supply chain, local procurements, and all those kind of things. So there is a proper way by which you can measure the outcomes. Environment, the same manner. You can measure carbon. You can estimate whether your reduction is as per 1.5 degree or 2 degree. Water, for example, you can measure. You can measure. The yes part of it, you can measure only the output. For example, how many people are trained, or how many people you have inducted. But what is the impact of that? It's a little kind of a tricky game compared to the earlier two dimensions to kind of really come out with the outcomes. And when that becomes tricky, that's where it tends to be kind of negated, because you do not exactly know how it is measured, and that's where it gets. But if you look at each of these dimensions, whether it is climate change or whether it is, there is a social element to each one of these. There is a impact in terms of climate change on the social fabric of the community as well. And there is even on the governance side, if you really look at it, there is an impact in terms of how the whole of the diversity plays inside the organization and all those kind of things. So I think I would say the so-called less importance which is given to the yes part of it, maybe because of the difficulty in kind of measuring the outcomes around that. But that's kind of changing nowadays. But I'll go back to say what Kelly briefly mentioned, that it depends upon the whole material dimensions. So I'm now part of a tech company. And to be very precise, our own environmental footprint would be much, much lesser, but the social footprint is going to be the mammoth footprint. And if I am looking at devising my strategy around ESG, the yes part of it would play a big, big role. So I think it again boils down to the materiality around the sector, the way people look at it. And don't forget that these are all, each one, if you talk about environment, it has a social impact as well. If you talk about social, it has an environmental impact as well. So these are all intertwined as well.
Thanks, Santosh. Charlie, can I bring you into this? Because I know that you've been a really strong advocate and role model for the position of women in leadership positions in businesses. What's your reflection on the sort of the connection, if you like, between diversity and inclusion within an organisation and its ability to really embed ESG in the way the organisation works? Is there a link between those two?
I would say that I would like to believe that D&I is in the DNA of an organization, should be in the DNA of an organization, and so must ESG. None of these things should be separate boxes, and so very crucial. I think it's when I look at ESG, it's about, honestly, I look at it, you should and must look at it from your heart. Like, are you a company which cares? Are you a company which believes in the purpose? And when the answer to that is yes, whether it's about human rights, whether it's around D&I, whether it's around learning and development, whether it's around community development and initiatives, we're putting up plants in a certain part of a country. You're taking something away from that community in a way, psychologically, they are not necessarily using it, feeding it into the grid. And you must ensure that you're doing it with them being a part of this. They must feel included, they must feel fulfilled, they must be connected to this without being harmed, for sure. right? And so how do you address this issue with empathy? I think should be at the heart of not only what we do, it should be at the heart of what anybody does with respect to any business they create and value one creates, financial or non-financial. So just really creating the social value is super critical, and having an inclusive sort of journey, in my view, is super critical. I do believe, women have so much to contribute, and they're only a part of the D&I sort of pie. But I think we must make sure that our journeys are inclusive. So the answer to your question is yes, of course. Having a inclusive sort of an environment in which we deliver is super critical to deliver for business growth, for our business model, for ESG, and for everything. So yes, a strong advocate of that.
And I loved that as you responded to that, Vaishali, you almost lifted it, into purpose. And again, it comes back to sort of Kelly's observation about Wesley just doing the right thing in this. And I suppose it goes right back to where I started, doesn't it, in 2019, and that growing argument that businesses are not there just for the money and the shareholder return. They're there for a higher purpose. There's a question in the chat which is about the incentives and penalties on organisations for delivering ESG needs and commitments. And I thought I'm struggling with it a bit, because I can't help feeling that if you need penalties and incentives, we've slightly missed the point. But I don't know, Kelly, does anyone want to just sort of pick up and play with that a bit further?
No, I think I mentioned when I started by saying it's the most irrelevant question you can get. I'm sorry. I mean, it's kind of what I'm saying is, what is my business case for this, or what is the penalties and incentives for this? I think we are past that. I mean, that was the last decade question. And I don't think now we are looking into that. I mean, look around you. I mean, the first bankruptcy is already recorded because of climate change, and look at the manner in which the companies are kind of changing. I mean, the biggest company in India in 2020's AGM talked about a strategy change, and in 2021's AGM it talked about another strategy change. You can really see the kind of impact it is kind of creating. I think the placebo effect is gone. I mean, you cannot be still sitting on that. You have control over everything, and there need to be some bit of incentives and penalties to do that.
But I guess I agree with that, Sandra. But I guess we're also saying that if there are companies that are still head in the sand, trying to ignore what's going on, then a combination of financial pressure from organisations like Kelly's and the disclosure and the public programme that will follow from disclosure of companies that are harming the planet and doing the wrong thing more generally. The two of those together are going to be really, really quite significant. Kelly, if I could take you back to, or you mentioned GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, that obviously came out with that headline-grabbing statement in Glasgow that they had about 41% of the world's private capital signed up to helping to support a series of commitments around net zero. I mean, do you? I mean, again, Brookfield's been talking about out front there, but do you think we're rapidly getting to a place where businesses won't be able to get money at any reasonable price if they're not doing the right thing?
Yeah, and I just want to go back to that last question, because I think we're being a bit unfair on that question. I do think there are, because it's such a complex system, it's quite confusing to really understand where to focus and what the penalties may be and what the incentives may be. I think the upside here, because we can't wait for regulation, we can't wait for policy. A lot of us who've been in sustainability for a long time have been waiting for it. So I think the upside about the opportunities will really come forward quickly. And to your point about being able to attract capital, I think it will be harder and harder. The cost of capital will continue to go up. And you could call that a penalty. But it just means for those who have leaned into this, embraced the energy transition and ESG, they will see access to capital, access to markets, access to customers, that others won't. And I know we're short on time, so I'll leave it there.
No, that's that. We've got a few more minutes. Vasali, I'm just going to come back to you. I mean, we've been talking very generally, of course, around the impact on businesses, and then touching from time to time on the sector that is the subject of this conversation specifically. Just briefly, do you think there's anything that's specifically different for the energy sector, or do you think, in a sense, they just have to do everything that the whole of the rest of the business has to do around ESG?
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. Somebody basically, asked me recently that, what's the role of a CSO in a company like Renew Power? In the sense that, do you even need this function? And that showed to me a certain mindset, which was so vastly different from our mindset within our company, where we believe that, one of the things, let me give you an example. So at the COP, there was the First Movers Coalition, which was founded, and we are a founding member, and it's got mostly hard to abate companies as members there. What we came in as a renewable energy company and said was that we will commit to attempting to use green steel to the extent it's possible, and hence show our commitment to push the envelope with respect to what we can do with respect to our supply chain, sourcing, etc. Right? So point is that people assume that I see a question in the chat box, like with respect to recycling and should I hop in there or hop back to your?
We're down to about the last minute, and I'm going to give Santosh 30 seconds, or at least 15.
Okay. So just very quickly, yes, of course, I think what is different is that we can get away perhaps by not doing much because, we are mitigating a lot more carbon than perhaps we should. But it's really important to think about how you're doing business. And that's super critical because at the end of the day, that's how we all can be compared. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you. 15 seconds, Santosh.
No, I take on Kelly's point, that opportunity side, and I really wanted to say, I mean, at the back you can see a scooter photograph, and I'm so just about, if you'd have asked any of the two-wheeler manufacturers in India 3 years back, who is your competition? They would not have found Ola. Ola was a cab aggregator at that time. You had Ola now kind of coming in here as the biggest two-wheeler, competitor. Talk about the four-wheelers. You asked the four-wheelers, who are your competition 2 years back? I don't think they would have dreamt that Foxconn is going to come to India with an EV vehicle. No way they would have realized. That's the opportunity space. Things are dramatically changing, and that's the incentive or the penalty, whatever it is.
Or to put it another way, businesses that don't get it probably won't be with us in another 10 years' time. Look, thank you so much to the three of you, Vishali, Kelly, Santosh. I'm hoping this is a fitting end to the Enrich conference. Certainly from my point of view, it's been a brilliant conversation. Thank you so much. And we'll now close this session.
Thank you. Great moderation, Richard. Thank you for this. Nice meeting all of you. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.
What a wonderful 2 days it has been at Enrich. We traversed a whole journey on the issue of our times, explored into aspects like pathways, justice, resilience, investments, technology, and especially the role of corporate leadership and boards. The panels discuss the various technical facets and challenges, including on energy efficiency, EV propagation, cybersecurity, role of markets, building human capabilities, and culture transformation. You would have also seen the Sustainable Innovation Lounge and amazing features there. We are particularly proud of the startups who came up there and showed the way to the world on how the new developments are going to be. It gives us tremendous hope that human ingenuity can get us to the better place that we are aiming to go for, that our planet needs us to be at. Enrich this year saw unprecedented participation in very large numbers